forests. So deep, so mysterious that if you knew who walked in them, you would shudder. But this is no ordinary forest. This is the land of the ancient warriors, kings and queens of Central Africa. Once upon a time, under these trees, fierce battle cries echoed, shields clashed, and epics that will be written in the dusty pages of history were forged here. So, dear listener, today I will take you on a journey to this mysterious land. From the vast kingdoms of the Kongo to the brave queens of Matamba, from the shining cities of Lunda to the shadowy warriors of Luba. It is a journey that will introduce you not only to the untold face of history, but also to the place of its heroes in the human legacy. Are you ready? Gird your sword, don your armor, and step by step into the unknown history of these ancient kingdoms. There are legends waiting for you in the depths of the forest. When we step into the vast lands of Central Africa, we see how a geography is intertwined not only with nature but also with history. These lands. Huge forests, endless rivers, wild nature stretching as far as the eye can see. But don't think that this green cover is calm. These lands are not only full of natural riches, but also of a power struggle that has been going on for centuries. Central Africa has been a strategic node throughout history. From the desert winds in the north to the ocean breezes in the south, this region was a crossroads of trade routes. Rivers were not only a source of life, but also mysterious gateways to distant lands. The Great Kongo River. Oh, who knows how many caravans traveled its waters, how many traders set off with their chests full of ivory, gold, and spices. But dear listener, what is really remarkable here is the enormous resources this land has. Think of the forests, the tracks of the ivory hunters, the places where rare trees were cut down, and the riches deep in the earth veins of gold, diamond deposits. These resources are the great secret behind the rise of the kingdoms in the region. From Kongo to Ndongo, from Lunda to Luba, they all fought for these riches, traded with each other, sometimes formed alliances, sometimes became enemies. This strategic location also made Central Africa a center of power. Many eyes were fixed on this land, both from inside and outside. Deep in the depths of those huge forests, there were local kingdoms as well as traders, soldiers, even missionaries from outside. When the great powers of Europe set foot on these fertile lands, they realized the strategic importance of this geography. From those days, the destiny of these lands began to be drawn in a way that would change the course of world history. Of course, life in these ancient lands was not only about wars and power struggles. There was life in the forests, there were peoples engaged in agriculture, a culture passed down from generation to generation with its rituals and traditions. Life in the shadows of those trees was not just about survival, it was where a culture took shape. I am going to take you back much further, to a time when Central Africa had not yet known great kingdoms. But every great story has a beginning, doesn't it? Thousands of years ago, when the forests and rivers were silent, there was a people moving through these lands, the Bantu peoples. The Bantu. They represented a movement, a wave, not a nation. Imagine like a great river, slowly but steadily moving forward. These peoples spread from east to west, from north to south, starting around 1000 BC. The Bantu migrations were no ordinary migrations. These people did not just change places, they brought a new life, a new culture wherever they went. When they set foot on the ancient lands of Central Africa, they changed the face of the land. With these peoples, agriculture entered deep into the jungle for the first time. The land was plowed and crops were planted. People began to settle down from hunting. And so out of those huge forests, smoky villages and small settlements began to rise. These villages would eventually become the harbingers of great kingdoms. But dear listener, It was not just about agriculture. The Bantu peoples carried their language, their beliefs, their traditions with them wherever they went. Imagine how these peoples lived in touch with the spirit of the forest. Nature was not just an environment for them, but a sacred entity. They believed that the trees had spirits, that the rivers harbored ancient gods. This belief shaped their social structure, religious rituals, and daily lives. In each village, in each community, there were spiritual leaders. They were a bridge between nature and people. Through rituals, dances, and prayers, they would call upon the gods and pray for rain and fertility of the land. It was at this time that these small villages began to unite. As people began to trust their leaders more, these settlements grew, expanded, and became kingdoms. The first kingdoms grew rich and powerful as agriculture spread. These kingdoms were great centers that held together the cultural diversity brought by the Bantu peoples. The leaders of those times were not only warriors, they were also spiritual leaders who ruled the land, protected the people, and communicated with the gods. Ah, those days. The foundations of these early kingdoms were the precursors of the great empires that followed. It all started with those ancient Bantu migrations. And so, dear listener, the forests once again echoed with people and the land began to reshape itself. Ah, the kingdom of the Kongo. A great empire rising from the depths of that vast land. This kingdom shone like a mighty sun in the heart of the jungle. But the story of the Kongo is not the story of a sudden rise, nor of a state founded by chance. The kingdom of Kongo was the product of many years of accumulation, patience, and struggle. In the 13th century, the kingdom slowly took shape as small settlements merged into a huge empire with a strong central authority. The foundation of this kingdom was based on a clever strategy. In a geography where many small kingdoms and tribes were scattered at the time, the Kongo had a centralized structure. The capital of the kingdom, Mbanza, Kongo, was not just a city but a power center. From this city, kings ruled all over the country, dispensed justice, and organized trade. The king, Wayne Kongo as he was called at the time, was both the protector of the people and a link between the gods and the people. He was not only a military leader, but also a spiritual leader. The success of these leaders not only expanded the borders of the kingdom, but also maintained order and peace within it. And trade. Ah, how can a kingdom prosper without trade? The Kingdom of Kongo made a great fortune thanks to Africa's trade network based on gold, ivory, and manpower. Gold from the depths of Africa was like blood flowing through the veins of this land. Ivory came from the tusks of the great forest elephants and whetted the appetites of traders from the north. The slave trade was, unfortunately, one of the darkest aspects of the kingdom. People were captured deep in the jungle, put in chains, and deported to other lands. While this trade network increased the kingdom's wealth, it also led Europe to turn its eyes to these lands. And then, that moment came. First contact with Europe. In the late 15th century, Portuguese sailors arrived from across the Great Ocean. The first encounters were filled with the curiosity of two different worlds. The kings of the Kongo watched these foreigners carefully. As the Portuguese came in search of gold and ivory, the king of the Kongo immediately recognized the opportunity to trade with these newcomers. But trade was not limited to the exchange of goods. Along with the Portuguese, Catholic missionaries also set foot in the Kongo. Christianity began to spread in these lands and kings began to reconsider their relationship with their gods. King Nzinga became the first king of Kongo to convert to Christianity. This ancient kingdom, which until then had worshipped the spirits of its ancestors, was now coming under the influence of a new religion. But the transition was much more complicated than it seemed. The people of the Kongo were firmly rooted in their traditions, and Christianity was an alien worldview. But under the leadership of the king, Christianity slowly began to spread and the kingdom established closer commercial and political ties with Portugal. But that first contact radically changed the fate of the Kingdom of Kongo. This ancient land was now intertwined not only with internal African affairs, but also with European interests. At the same time as the kingdom was growing stronger, it would find itself in a great maelstrom. Ah, dear listener, such is the story of the birth and rise of the Kingdom of Kongo. But remember, every rise comes at a price. Ah, Queen Nzinga, what a great leader, what a great warrior. In the lands of that time, in the kingdoms of Ndongo and Matamba, her name was a legend. But it was not a legend, dear listener, it was the truth. Nzinga was a woman born into hardship, a woman born into war. And she emerged on the stage of history as a leader who could stand up to the Portuguese invaders. If you had lived in her time, you would have been stunned by her mesmerizing leadership. In the early 17th century, there was great turmoil in the Ndongo kingdom. Portugal had already set its sights on this part of Africa and was exploiting the people through cruel methods such as the slave trade. The former king of Ndongo tried to stand against this invasion, but as time passed, things became more and more difficult. And in the midst of this chaos, Nzinga appeared on the scene. Nzinga had grown up not just as a princess, but as a warrior and diplomat. When she claimed her father's throne, no one could have imagined that she would put up such a great resistance. Ah, dear friends, Nzinga's strategic acumen shone not only on the battlefields but also at the diplomatic table. His coolness and persistence in negotiations with the Portuguese were the talk of the town. It is said that once, when the Portuguese governor refused to give him a chair to sit on, Nzinga made his servant kneel down and sat on his back, as if nothing had happened. This small but powerful gesture showed the world what a determined and upright leader he was. Nzinga was not only a diplomat but also a great strategist. He never backed down in his fight against the Portuguese. He personally led his troops on the battlefields, set traps and surprised his enemies with surprise attacks. But his real strength was his ability to unite disparate groups. She organized not only the Ndongo people but also many surrounding tribes against the Portuguese and forged alliances. This was the epitome of what a woman leader could achieve in the heart of Africa. But Nzinga's struggle was not only fought with weapons. She knew how to sit at the table with her enemies and forge alliances when necessary. He brought the kingdom of Matamba under his control and further consolidated his power. Under her leadership, Matamba and Ndongo came together and put up the greatest resistance against the Portuguese. Nzinga left an indelible mark on African history with her courage and determination as a woman leader. Nzinga's reign is not only full of military victories, but also a powerful message that women can lead and change the destiny of a people. By proving how women can take their place in society, Nzinga became an inspiration not only to her own people, but to the women of the world. Ah, dear listener, if you had lived at that time, you would have seen firsthand her daring battles, her shrewd diplomatic maneuvers, and her leadership qualities. Nzinga's name will remain a legend throughout history. Today, her legacy resonates not only in the lands of Ndongo and Matamba, but around the world. The powerful Queen of Africa is remembered as a figure who inspired even the feminist movements of the modern era. And this is etched in history as the story of the triumph not just of a warrior, but of a people, a culture, a woman. Ah, the story I am going to tell you now is the story of two great empires, born in the heart of those vast forests and echoing through the centuries, Luba and Lunda. These kingdoms were majestic states that emerged from the depths of the ancient forests of Africa, bringing power and culture to their region. But dear listener, Luba and Lunda were not just kingdoms, they were true empires, rooted in deep-rooted traditions and fueled by the mysterious powers of the jungle. By the mid-17th century, trade routes were taking shape in the African interior. The Luba Empire, which dominated those lands, grew and flourished on these routes. With its centralized structure and organized system of governance, the Luba left its mark on Africa's political history. Luba kings ruled like god-kings in those vast forests. The king was also the most important spiritual leader of his people. The people of Luba revered their kings, just as they honored nature and the spirits of their ancestors. These kings protected and guided their people, not only in the physical world but also in the spiritual world. The power of the Luba Empire was not only due to the might of its leaders, but also to its trade routes. Gold, copper, and salt were the most valuable treasures of these lands. These riches not only ensured the prosperity of the Luba lands, but also allowed it to forge strong ties with neighboring kingdoms. The roads along the river's bends were lined with the footprints of not only merchants but also warriors who carried the might of the kingdom. But dear friends, Luba was not alone. At the same time, the Lunda Empire was rising from the depths of the forest. Lunda's foundation, like Luba's, was based on strategic intelligence. The two empires forged deep ties with each other and achieved great territorial dominance. The centralized structure of Lunda, like that of Luba, was strong, but they were not limited to administration and trade. The Lunda Empire also excelled on the battlefield. Their war strategies were as if they were born out of nature. Lurking in the shadows of the forest, Lunda warriors would stun their enemies when they suddenly attacked. Strategy and speed were the greatest weapons of this empire. But these kingdoms did not stop at war. They also made their mark in history with their cultural heritage. The people of Luba and Lunda were masters of art, metalwork, and handicrafts. The sculptures and masks made in Luba and Lunda still fascinate art historians. These works of art were not only of aesthetic value, but also reflected the spiritual beliefs of their communities, their devotion to their ancestors, and how they saw the world. In each mask, in each sculpture, you can see the ancient wisdom of these kingdoms and their interconnectedness with nature. Luba and Lunda left an echo not only through their power, but also through their cultural legacy. Today, you can still see traces of these two empires all over Africa. Metalworking in those times culminated in the processing of copper from deep in the forests. It was so skillfully done that these artifacts were not only commodities of trade, but also symbols of power and wealth. Dear listener, the story of these two great empires echoed in the forests of the heart of Africa. They were not only kingdoms that expanded their territories, they also wove their culture, faith, and art into the very soul of these lands. The Luba and Lunda empires were legends that grew in the jungle, inspired by the power of nature, and lasted for centuries. And these legends live on even beyond time. My dear friends, I will now tell you about a period that changed the destiny of Central Africa, a period when the rustle of the rivers echoed with the footsteps of European explorers emerging from the shadows of the forests. In the 19th century, the first serious contacts from the outside world to this mysterious land of Africa began. Until then, Luba, Lunda, Kongo, and many other kingdoms had lived their lives with their own internal order and rhythms. However, when the Europeans arrived, this ancient order would be shattered. European explorers made their way into the heart of Africa in search of new trade routes and riches. But these voyages were not just innocent explorations for gold and ivory. They found the raw materials and manpower needed for the Industrial Revolution that kept the wheels of Europe turning. Their view of these lands in those days was one of exploitation and fortune hunting. The slave trade poisoned Africa's veins like poison. Slaves were the fuel for Europe's giant factories, people to be forcibly transported to new worlds. The slave trade swept through these lands like a great hurricane. European merchants expanded their slave markets through trade networks with indigenous tribes and kingdoms. Yes, my friends, the slave trade expanded rapidly at that time, and many African kingdoms found themselves involved in it. While some kings tried to fight the trade, others, unfortunately, joined the system and made deals with the Europeans to protect their people. Dear listeners, each one of them was in a hurry to survive. Some succumbed to the slave trade, others fought to the end to refuse to accept this destructive trade. The rulers of the Kingdom of the Kongo, of powerful states like Lunda and Luba, had to cope with this new order. However, the internal structure of the region was undergoing a major change. As Europe's trade network expanded, these empires in the heart of Africa began to lose their commercial and political balance. As the trade routes came under European control, precious resources such as gold and ivory were slipping away. Moreover, the slave trade shook not only the economy, but also the social fabric. With the slave trade, the bonds within societies began to unravel. Enmities and betrayals between neighboring tribes increased, and everyone was looking for a way to survive. During this period, European states such as Portugal, Belgium, France, and Britain began to establish new relations with the kingdoms in the region. These relations, which started as commercial partnerships at first, turned into dependence over time. By weakening and pitting the kingdoms of the region against each other, the Europeans paved the way for colonization. But dear listener, these kingdoms were not idle. For a while, powerful kingdoms like Lunda and Luba used military and diplomatic maneuvers to protect their territories. However, these efforts would not be enough in the face of the technological superiority and unending ambition of the European powers. The dark shadow of the slave trade. It scarred not only people but also the soul of a nation. Wars, internal strife, and betrayals eroded the power of the great kingdoms that once ruled these lands. Military structures weakened because manpower was running out. Artisans, farmers, warriors, all were enslaved or forced to flee. The trade routes were now under European control, and the economic balance in the region was upset. In this land of riches, the kingdoms that once ruled proudly were left defenseless in the face of Europe's destructive power. And it was in this last pre-colonial period that the political and military structure in Central Africa was shaken to its very foundations. Kings were now trying to defend not only their lands but also their people against the Europeans. But my friends, each time the Europeans came back with a new strategy. Diplomatic games, local alliances, and the arms trade weakened the resistance of these kingdoms. Kongo, Lunda, and other kingdoms, once strong and independent, became, in the eyes of the Europeans, only lands to be conquered. My dear listener, towards the painful end of those times, the ancient kingdoms that had taken root in these lands were on the brink of great change. The storm of colonialism was approaching, and they felt that their old world was fast disappearing. History will never forget the last throes of those days, the desperate struggle of a people. My friends, the late 19th century was a dark time in Africa, when the old blood was slowly draining from its veins and kingdoms were on the brink of collapse. The thundering jungles of Central Africa, once resounding with the echoes of warriors, now yielded to the ambitions of European powers. Never forget this period, for the destiny of this land was shaped by the hands of people from far and wide. And they came to plunder this land only for the sake of wealth and profit. The Berlin Conference in 1884. The European powers discussed among themselves how to divide Africa. Dear listener, this conference was a turning point for Central Africa. The great empires of the time, Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, Portugal, they all carved Africa into pieces on maps. Thousands of years of history, culture, and traditions of the peoples living in these lands were ignored. Maps were redrawn and borders were defined as if there were no people living in those regions. The rich forests of the Congo fell into the greedy hands of King Leopold II of Belgium. Leopold declared these lands his private property. People were enslaved, worked, and lost their lives for ivory and rubber. In the Congo alone, millions of people perished in this colonial system. But my dear friends, this was not just the fate of Kongo. Every corner of Africa was suffering the same fate. This new colonial order, whose borders were drawn, brought an end to traditional structures. One by one, kingdoms collapsed in the face of Europe's weapons, diplomacy, and insidious traps. Great kingdoms like Lunda and Luba resisted the consequences of the Berlin Conference as best they could. Ah, my friends, the leaders of these kingdoms tried everything to fight to the end. The noble kings of the Lunda Empire tried to make strategic alliances with the Europeans in order to protect their lands, but unfortunately these efforts were soon in vain, because they were up against not just merchants but entire colonial armies. In the face of European soldiers equipped with modern weapons, these ancient kingdoms fighting with traditional methods of warfare had no chance. As the colonial forces settled in the lands, villages and cities were taken under control. Traditional forms of governance were destroyed. Kings became mere symbolic figures. Ah, the pain of those days. The people, once proud warriors of the forests, were now under the control of European rulers. Everything was changing: trade, agriculture, social structure. Europeans started a great transformation in these lands, not only economically, but also culturally and socially. The cultural fabric of Central Africa was rapidly eroded. Traditional leadership structures were uprooted. In order to keep the population under control, the colonial rulers replaced the kingdoms with their own administrative systems. In the eyes of the colonial rulers, kings were merely a relic of the past. For generations they had been the protectors, warriors, and sages of their people. Now, however, they were being played as pawns in the hands of the Europeans. In this new order that took shape after the Berlin Conference, the borders of not only Central Africa but the whole of Africa were redrawn. And that, my dear friends, is when the foundations of the borders of today's modern Africa were laid. But these borders did not correspond to the history, culture, or language of the peoples. A map was drawn that suited only the interests of the European powers. And this map laid the foundation for major problems in Africa's future. Wars, conflicts, and internal strife have continued for generations as a result of these artificial borders. Ah, my friends, the painful passage of those days marked the end of an era. As kings and peoples bowed to European powers, the ancient spirit of Central Africa was slowly fading away. The harsh and brutal conditions of the colonial era were creating a new reality in these lands. Kingdoms collapsed, traditions were erased, and the harsh realities of the modern world reshaped this ancient land. This colonial era, my friends, which began in the gloom of those days, irreversibly changed the eternal history of Central Africa. Ah, my friends, yes, the glorious era of kingdoms may have come to an end, but their spirit continues to echo deep within Central Africa. What we inherit from those days is not just a history that transcends borders, but also the culture, language, rituals, and arts that the people have cherished for centuries. The stories of ancient kingdoms are like legends flowing through the veins of modern Central Africa, leaving deep imprints on the lives of these people today. So, my friends, kingdoms like the Luba and Lunda have been the guardians of lands where people have lived together, preserving social order and harmony for centuries. The stories that the Luba people have passed down through their language, the rituals, the communities that gather in sacred corners of the forests to pray. All of this is the unique legacy left by these ancient kingdoms to modern cultures. Many Central African communities still carry the essence of the Luba and Lunda kingdoms, living out these traditions as if they were precious secrets. Every language, every song holds an ancient story, a tale of a kingdom, the bravery of a hero. The art of the Kingdom of Kongo, my friends, is another invaluable heritage that reflects the craftsmanship of the people even today. Copper bracelets, intricately crafted masks dedicated to the gods, each piece tells its own unique story. Ah, those masks. These artworks that summon the spirits of great leaders, gods, and ancestors are still revered within communities. The youth of modern Central Africa reinterpret this rich cultural legacy created by their ancestors, carrying it into the present without losing touch with their roots. In countries like Kongo, Angola, and Gabon, traditional dances and music echo the footsteps of their ancient warriors in every rhythm. And let me remind you, dear friends, that today in every village, town, and city of Central Africa, the tales of the old kingdoms are passed down from generation to generation. The people take pride in the kingdoms established by their ancestors, the struggles they faced, and their determination to survive. From the nobility of the Kingdom of Kongo to Nzinga's heartfelt resistance, every detail has left a mark on the identity of modern Central Africa. Even behind the borders set by colonizers, the strong resonance of these cultures can still be heard today. The people of Central Africa continue to see themselves as the descendants of these kingdoms. So my friends, when you look at the modern societies of Central Africa, you will still find the language, art, music, and traditions of the ancient kingdoms. These are the marks that can never be erased. The deep stories of the past are like roots that make up the essence of this land. Every value passed down from those days continues to keep the people of Central Africa standing tall against challenges. My dear friends, we've reached the end of this deep journey. The epic tales of Central Africa's ancient kingdoms have been like hidden treasures, quietly waiting for centuries within those magnificent lands. The courageous resistance of Kongo, Luba, and Nzinga, along with the artistry of Lunda, these stories have long been overlooked pieces of world history. But now, every moment buried beneath the earth, every battle cry echoing in the shadows of the forests, calls out to us like secrets waiting to be revealed. Think about it, my friends, why have the stories of this region been heard so late? Colonialism, power struggles, political intrigues. Throughout all these processes, the unique history of the Central African people was ignored and sometimes even forgotten. This land's history isn't just a simple tale to be written with a few pens, it's a vast painting that is a part of the whole world. To understand that great painting, we need to retell Central Africa's lost history and hear the voices of the ancient kingdoms once again. That's why these stories hold great value, not just for the people of Central Africa, but for humanity as a whole. Because, my friends, in those ancient lands where these kingdoms existed, dozens of different cultures, languages, and traditions still coexist today. What Central Africa has contributed to the historical stage also sheds light on the modern world. These ancient kingdoms laid the foundations not only for their own lands, but also for regional and global relations. The connections they formed with various cultures, the relationships shaped by the twists and turns of trade, the values they added to art and science. Today, the people of modern Central Africa are embracing this deep heritage and rediscovering the legacy of their ancestors. My dear friends, even if the world changes and people evolve, the magnificent legacies of the past always leave a mark, just like a leaf floating down a river. The story of this land will continue to flow in the river of history forever. So when we hear these stories, we must shine a light on the details of the past that have remained in the shadows. Each story is part of the collective memory of the entire world, not just a distant country. My dear friends, we've taken a journey together through the magnificent stories of Central Africa that have been lost in the depths of the past. We talked about the rise of kingdoms, the battles hidden in the mists of the forests, the sacrifices of leaders, and the legacies that have come down to us today. These stories aren't just dusty pages from ancient times, each one is a living, breathing heritage. Here, in every corner of these ancient lands, the spirits of our ancestors still roam. The people of the kingdom see themselves as the descendants of those strong heroes from the old days. But remember, my friends, as we delve into such deep history, we learn something important. These tales are not just echoes of the past, they are guides that tell us about today and remind us who we are. The rise of each kingdom, the lessons learned from every battle, the The legacies left by every leader reflect our world today. No matter how far we go, we will always remember our roots when we look into this mirror. Our roots show us who we are, where we came from, and how we move forward into the future. And so we've come to the end of another journey, my dear friends. Each story opened a door, whispering to us the lost but never forgotten history of Central Africa. Sharing, remembering, and reviving these tales together, this is truly priceless. Now, perhaps we'll all take a deep breath after this narrative. But you must know that every voice echoing from the past, every struggle, and every success will continue to live in our memories forever. Until another day, in another place, may we set sail toward the magnificent history of the past once again. So now, dear friends, goodbye, and I look forward to reuniting on the endless journey of knowledge.